be a fabulous event tomorrow for the UK Financial Crime Leaders Summit.
Bang for buck, this is the best event that we attend all year.
So for me, today's event exceeded all expectations, and I've been really, really impressed by the calibre of speakers. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Mr. Hunt, how are you?
I am good. How are you?
Very well. It's good to see you. I'm liking
Likewise. Hello, hello.
Hi. Morning, everyone.
So one of the things, Christian, I'd love for us to kind of start with is, your background initially was in kind of day-to-day operational compliance, so to speak. And what I really loved, and it was when you were at UBS, if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of where the transformation over to the more behavioural aspect of compliance happened. And you're one of the first people in this industry that I've actually seen making that transformation. And it is a critical transformation in terms of understanding the psychology behind the work that we do, because a lot of, especially modern day financial scams, are very much based on kind of very sophisticated psychological manipulation. So I'd love to kind of start, and if Jane doesn't mind, kind of start to understand how you moved from kind of compliance into the behavioral science side of things, and then just talk. Then we can maybe talk organically then about what we're seeing moving forward.
Sure. So I probably should start by saying that my adventure it's always been there. I've always been curious about people, what made them tick. So I did a literature degree. And if you think about literature, it's writing about humans, right? And why they do the things that they do and telling stories about them. So it's always been there. And I guess I was just looking for an outlet for it. But the real eye-opening moment for me was post the 2008 crisis, remember back to then, they were looking for people that weren't natural regulators. And so I got a call from a headhunter saying, how do you fancy working at the Bank of England? And so, cut a long story short, I end up at the regulator heading up international banking supervision and join the Bank of England when they break the regulator up, become COO there, realize I don't want to be a central banker, and do something unusual that you can't do in every jurisdiction, which is I go and join one of the firms that I've been supervising. And so that firm was UBS. And you'll know, Oonagh, that if a regulator's been spending a lot of time looking at you, it's not because you're doing a stellar job. And so I'd been dealing with things like a rogue trader, tons of kind of issues that UBS had. And the reason I went to them was I recognized that there was a real desire to try and do the right thing on the basis that they'd crashed or come close to crashing the car on so many occasions. And so I had this really unusual experience of eating my own regulatory cooking, in the sense that I'd imposed a load of things as the regulator in the UK. A lot of the kind of issues had been in the UK. So I'd had a sort of steering hand in that. And I had to implement them in the part of the firm where it probably made least sense, because I was responsible for compliance, not risk, in the asset management business for the firm as a whole, and Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And so what had happened, and that excluded the London investment bank and the Swiss business. So it's kind of some smaller offices in Europe and then the asset management business globally. And what I discovered as I was doing that was many of the things made sense from a regulatory, centralized perspective, but weren't landing. And so I would get emails from myself inviting me to go on mandatory training. Reflect on that a second. Invite to mandatory training. It can't be, it's one or the other, right? You either invite me or it's mandatory. It can't be both. So already cognitive dissonance there. Or I would own policies that made little or no sense for the business I was in. And so I was looking at these things and just thinking, this is weird. And I own this problem. And so because emails are being sent out in my name, I own them. I'm like, this is a bit weird. And it dawned on me that the reason this felt weird was we were not thinking about the people that were on the receiving end of this. And so I suddenly went, actually, compliance, if we think about it, is the business of influencing human decision-making, because you can say to an organization or a legal entity, be compliant. Nothing much is going to happen. It's the people within that organization that are going to determine how compliant you are or aren't. And then the second bit of my portfolio was operational risk. And I realized that whenever something went wrong, there was always a human component involved, either causing the problem in the first place or making it worse by the way they reacted or didn't. So put that together, you suddenly think, well, if we're in the business of understanding what makes people tick, then shouldn't we be looking and understanding that properly? And so behavioral science, the thing I'd been looking at sort of on the side of desk, been interested in, suddenly loomed large. And that's where the journey began.
Amazing, amazing. I really love that you focused on the kind of, should I say, the forgotten factor, so to speak. Why do you think the human element has been deprioritized in compliance frameworks across financial institutions? How did we become so process obsessed, as opposed to thinking about ensuring that people understand what it is they're supposed to do? And I suppose kind of 101 of the FCA's kind of 11 principles, acting with integrity. Like, where did we miss that and go and jump into process? Is it over regulation? Has it been enforcement actions? Is it a fear of not having all of those boxes ticked as a protectionism when an enforcement action does occur?
So I think beautifully the answer can be explained by behavioral science as well, right? So if we look at why do people accept the way things have always been? Well, changing things is really hard.
Yeah.
And if we have to admit that we're in the business of influencing people, then we start to have to take responsibility for that. So the narrative that financial services, and to be fair, other industries have always loved, is this: something has gone wrong, let's find the people responsible and fire those people, the bad apple logic. But actually, if you look at human decision making, lots of the things that go wrong are not necessarily people setting out to do the wrong thing. It's circumstances put them in a position where, they are either incentivized to do something, or they forget, or it's not bad people doing bad things. It's just that these things occur through various dynamics. Now, that's really uncomfortable for organizations to grasp hold of. It's also really uncomfortable for regulators as well, by the way, because you then have to start to go, maybe we have a bit more influence over this than we'd originally thought. And so what I'm doing in exposing this behavioral dynamic is saying, we really need to get to grips with this. And it's horrible, complicated, and messy. And you, organizations and regulators, play a role in the influence. So this bad apple argument doesn't work. And I use a traffic analogy to explain it, because yes, sure, occasionally you will get somebody that sets out to do the wrong thing, but in the vast majority of cases, that's not the case. There's a bit more to it than that. So let's take a traffic analogy. The logic that is often deployed is what I call speed camera logic, right? So we put a speed camera on roads to catch and deter drivers that are breaking the speed limit. That makes perfect sense in that context, because it is drivers that are the unit of risk. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't be monitoring those things. We should, but we should recognize there's a second bit of traffic logic that's often not thought about, which is what you might call the accident hotspot. So here's a stretch of road where there are lots of accidents.
Yeah.
Of course, we hold the drivers accountable, but we also say, hold on a minute. There must be a reason why all of these drivers are having accidents here. And it can't be because they're all deliberately setting out to do it. There must be something in the environment that's causing that problem. So let's change the nature of the junction, make the junction clearer, slow traffic down, do something to help intervene. Otherwise, what you end up doing, and this has been the problem in financial services, is you could ban all those drivers from driving, but you wouldn't solve the problem, because you get the next set of drivers having accidents. So I like to look at it and go, you need to think, yes, of course, individual accountability matters, but we need to start thinking about the environmental factors that are driving these behaviors. Now, all of that, to go back to your original question, is really hard, right? And it requires you to take some responsibility for what's going on. So it is much easier to sit there and have a sort of like, everything's fine, nothing to see here approach. Look, we've done everything. Oh, look at these. Oh, I didn't realize, how did that happen? But we told them not to do it, all that kind of stuff. So it's just easier not to do it.
You mentioned accountability there, and it actually is something which I've kind of observed quite closely. And I really feel that there's a mass confusion now between personal accountability and personal liability. It's, how do we empower people to do the right thing without paralyzing them with fear that if they do, that they could be liable? And I hear a lot of people asking nowadays about, do compliance officers need to have like insurance? If I've taken on, a CF, a controlled function, that's showing my age. If I'm a CF10, CF11 approved person, do I need to have an insurance policy to kind of cover my back in terms of the liability that I'm going to be exposed to because of accountability regimes?
Yeah, I mean, and you can totally understand the fear, right? Yeah. Because particularly, and it's all hellfire and damnation stuff about, if you don't do, you are personally responsible, blah, 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 and it's on your head, be it. And the logic, there is some logic to that from a regulatory perspective, because the traditional thing was always, senior people would say things like, oh, well, this is a big organization, I can't possibly know what's going on and all these different things, or it was outsourced. There's some kind of like, wasn't me type excuse, and they distance themselves from it. So the accountability regime is an attempt by regulators to say, we don't care. It's happening on your watch, and you need to take responsibility. It's sort of like the logic that the military would deploy, saying, you know, so it happened on your watch, so you're responsible for everything that goes on. So I think that's sensible. But the way it gets deployed, I think you're right. It absolutely puts the fear of God into people. And of course, you don't want people to take it lightly and go, well, it doesn't really matter because they're not going to do anything if I don't. But the flip side is we have to have an adult relationship. And I'm struck by this idea that we see in certain other industries of a just culture, where the regulatory presumption that they begin with is that people are trying to do the right thing, right? And they're operating on a sensible basis, and they're doing their best to get the right outcome. So we trust you until we have reason not to. Yeah. And this is probably a terrible time to be recording this because we're talking about, I'm about to mention the airline industry, and there was the Air India incident that happened recently. But if you look at the way that industry handled it, the reason we have very few of those incidents is that there's a trust relationship between the regulator and the regulatee. So you get in more trouble for not reporting stuff than you do if you report things. And the regulator makes sure that knowledge is shared, and they recognize that things are going to go wrong. And so it's not a case of, we'd rather it didn't happen and we do everything we can not. But there is a level of trust that's there and a level of knowledge sharing information. And so it's not regulators trying to catch you out. It's a case of working together to make sure bad things don't happen. Now, the challenge in banking is, of course, that bad things they don't manifest themselves in that same way. So it's not always perceived to be, although we know the knock-on consequences of it can be, a matter of life and death. Yeah. And so that's the challenge.
It's interesting. Apologies, I didn't mean to talk over you there. It's interesting that you mentioned trust, because if we now look at like social media companies that are coming through, they don't have compliance departments. What they actually have, many of the new ones, they have trust and safety departments. So they've actually completely eradicated and which I think is absolutely correct, the kind of categorization of a department as compliance. But I think that trust and safety mantra is something that we could really benefit from. But in terms of trust, and I suppose we're going to go on to technology and humanity here, but also to drive change within our industry. And at the moment, we're going through a substantial change where it's data first, tech driven. And in order to get the right combination of risk controls that work for your business, some of it will be trial and error. So we need to have a psychological safety within the industry, that we know mistakes will happen, but not because of bad intentions, because that's just part of innovation. Getting it right can be 99% failure, 1% success. And the top performing 1% of companies in the world, the reason they are so magnificent is because of psychological safety within innovation. But that doesn't really seem to filter through to financial institutions. Can you talk a bit about how often it is missing, and potentially, and again, why is it missing? Like, where have we lost the ability to innovate and be psychological safe within our roles?
So I think a few things to pick up there. The first one is, I think, on what you might term sort of perfect compliance or 100% compliance. That is impossible, right? That is never, ever, ever going to happen. And just in the same way that none of us is 100% within the law, right? We all break the law on some level. Hopefully, nobody on this call is obviously going to be doing anything that's massively illegal. But we've all broken speed limits. We probably crossed the road when the little man is red. Whatever, all of those sorts of things. We all bend and break laws. All right. So if we looked at that as a total, no organization is going to ever be able to be 100% compliant. So when I look at that, I think it's really important that organizations draw a distinction between. And I love Netflix use a really good analogy here, where this is for them running their business as opposed to their product. They look at recoverable and irrecoverable errors. So irrecoverable errors is stuff that is, as the name implies, difficult or impossible to recover from. Recoverable errors is stuff we'd rather not have happen, but if it does, we can manage it. And I think we all have that in our day-to-day existence. We all understand that intuitively as human beings. And I think part of the challenge with the psychological safety is there's this myth that all rules are equal, that we can't have any breaching of any rules whatsoever, which we know is an unrealistic objective. And so this thing is sort of set there and as the benchmark, and regulators set it as the benchmark, and firms set it as the benchmark internally. Now, I'm not saying you say to people, hey, don't worry if you break a few rules, it doesn't matter, right? But there's ways that you can communicate. This really matters, and this also matters, but less. And the tone that we use so we have to get away from that particular thing before we can even start. That requires being honest. And so all these organizations have this value of honesty, my favorite one is the annual attestation, right? And I'll paraphrase ridiculously slightly, confirm that you have complied with memorized, blah, 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 all the rules. Well, that's blatant. Nobody can do that, right? Generally, the way they're set up is, and it's designed so that you can fire people who you discover have broken the rules. Yeah. And for the very small percentage of people that we want to do that to, right, it makes the legal department's job a bit easier. I'm not in the business of making life easier for lawyers. I'm in the business of improving culture overall. So I look at it and say, why are we letting the tail wag the dog, putting every single employee through a process that is pretty pointless because we know that everybody's lying to get through it. But even more importantly, the signaling effect of it is we're institutionalizing the act of lying. And why do I say that? Well, compare other situations where we're required to sort of sign something to get something to make something happen. Software downloads, right? Or car rental, right? We have no idea what we're signing. We just get because we want to get on with whatever it is, right? So if we do it in those situations, what the hell are we going to do when we up the stakes and say, to keep your job, you need to sign this? We're putting people in the same mindset as they would be in these other things. So that's just an illustration of an exercise that is not only, I would argue, probably pointless in of itself, because I'm not sure the legal case does stack up, but more to the point, it's sending a signal about some mythical world that doesn't exist, which is that everybody can memorize all of the rules. And so lots and lots of the exercises that we do point towards this 100% compliance objective. We have to move away from that and be honest about these things so that we can then get into a world where, because you can't offer psychological safety to people if you are perpetuating a myth that is just not true. And so I think it's important to just look at the scale of the problem. And this is why this stuff is awkward, right? Because I'm opening up the box and going, if you want to solve this problem, we better start looking at some of these other dynamics that are there. And and then behavioral science can help us understand why people don't want to do that.
Absolutely. And say, Christian, I remember whenever I first saw kind of you moving towards this direction, I know a few years back, and I actually, if I'm honest with you, hadn't really sat down and thought through exactly what you're speaking to, the human element and everything that we're doing, and the people first approach. And I have to say, I take my hat off to you, and I'm not saying this to blow hot air. I'm taking my hat off to you because you identified one of the biggest failures, in my honest opinion, within the industry, that we dehumanized what is, in fact, a process that requires us to be entirely human, if that makes sense. And the question I would ask then is, if you had to give one message to senior leadership in financial institutions today about people in compliance, what would that be? Like, what do you think fundamentally, if every leader could implement this one simple thing, it could be transformational for their business?
I'll give you a quote I like to roll out quite frequently as a sort of philosophy, and then we can come into what that might mean. And the quote is, we need to think not about how we would like people to behave, but how they are likely to behave. What I mean by that is we design loads of processes in a sort of delusional presumption that, for example, people are, the interests of the firm and the interests of the individual are 100% aligned. So we say things to them like, if we do this, the firm is going to get fined. Now, what's really interesting about that is, one, the individual's not going to feel that, right? This is something that's miles away from them. It's big numbers, and the organization picks up the tab anyway. And yes, you can say it'll flow through to your bonus, but we're not going to feel that. But the second thing is, this is an industry where people move around. I mean, let's be honest, lots of people in financial services are mercenaries, right? They go around and they go, if somebody will pay you more money to do the same thing, right, you will go there. So this idea that we're tying things in and sort of, I'm not saying that we don't talk about what is good for the firm, because for some employees that will work as a message, but we should recognize that we'd love it if people were 100% loyal, stuck with the organization forever. But we know that's not going to happen because, one, the dynamics are there. Probably the senior leadership have themselves moved around. But the second thing is, we also make people redundant on a whim quite often. And so this idea that you can rely on loyalty in that sort of environment is misplaced. Feed that through to all of the other processes that are there, and you can say things like, well, we told them to be ethical, right? That's what you would like people, or what you say you would like people to do. It is not what they are likely to do if you present them with incentives and processes that mean it's more likely they're going to do the opposite thing. So I start with that very simple philosophy, but moving into, well, have a look at what do your processes actually do? What are the real factors here? And one of the things I would focus people on is unintended consequences. It is we talk at medical, in the medical industry, right? If you can't release a packet of pills to someone without at least putting on the side what the side effects are. Now, let's ignore the fact that side effects are not a thing, right? There's no such thing. Side effects is just stuff that happens that we don't want to have happen. So we call it side effect. It's just another effect. But there are going to be side effects and unintended consequences of all of the things that we do, incentive programs, communications, training. Now, sometimes it'd be relevant, small stuff, but we should go out there and say, okay, what harm is this going to do as well as what good is it? And there's a presumption that every piece of training, every rule, everything, all incentives will work perfectly. And we know that they don't. And so I'm trying to bring a bit of realism in. So think not what we would like people to do, but what they are likely to do is a pretty good proxy for looking at the world, I think.
I absolutely love that. The compliance officers are mercenaries. I think I'm going to steal that one, write an article, and then credit it to you. But yeah, I have to say, compliance officers leave because they've read the policy and they know it doesn't protect them, and they're very quickly going to run after a role that gives them a seat at the table, a decent bonus, and a team that can actually support them in doing what they need to do. And I think that's really the biggest challenge here. We see it what happens, and I do apologize for the language, but there's no other better way. When the shit hits the fan, we've seen how there still continues to be within our industry, and we see it time and time again, an initial attitude of we're a team, but when something goes wrong, we look for the scapegoat. And in order to drive that culture of psychological security and also team, I think that's something we need to factor into accountability regimes as well, because it's a very, very delicate balance. And obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, both burnout and sanity play major factors in the industry as well, especially within compliance. And one of the things that I'm quite conscious of, and I've seen time and time again, are KPIs for backlogs. And it scares the living daylights out of me when I see that, even for, the closure of audit or regulatory findings. I've seen so many times that instead of holistically looking at how we could do this for the best approach to the holistic risk structure, we quickly close out a regulatory finding or audit finding with a plaster over that gap. And when I've asked, before to people like, why aren't you looking at this holistically? The response is, my KPIs depend upon me closing out this audit finding within this specified time period. And the same goes for, transaction monitoring, backlogs, KYC backlogs. I need to close out a TM backlog, 10 of these a day, or a KYC backlog, 1.8 or 2 client files a day. And when you put those KPIs into play, the person is no longer looking at doing the right thing or trying to get right down to basics. They're just trying to do it to, should we say this, A, to keep a job, and B, to ensure that they meet their bonus criteria. So I know that we've spent many, many years focusing on KPIs as an industry. I think that KPIs, which in any way drives somebody to effect a closure of items within specified time periods, is a very, very dangerous approach for organizations. I don't know if you probably have had many discussions around KPIs and compliance culture.
Yes. And I agree entirely with what you said, right? Which is this is sort of, there's an attempt to quantify things because that's convenient. And I think one of the challenges is lots of things in compliance, good judgment is not something that you can quantify. And so we're putting time limit on something. It feels like it's a good idea. Let's clear that here's a plan that we can show to people that says we're on track to do these things. But you're absolutely right? The quickest thing to do is just to close files and move on and ignore stuff. So that comes back to, what are we incentivizing people to do? And you can say, I'm incentivizing them to do this properly in as quick a time as possible. But actually doing it properly, there's no qualitative component there that measures whether you are doing it properly or not. And so I think this is a challenge. But I on this one, I pin it on regulators, because I don't think regulators should allow this to go on. We all, this is not hidden, to your point, right? We all know that this is happening. So when regulators impose things on firms, I think it's really important to recognize, to say, well, how are we imposing it on firms? And actually, I would be double dinging firms and saying, if the answer they come up with is one that's sort of performative and will clear, looks like it's a rush job, you should be asking this, because you're causing more damage in some cases, because what you're doing is, one, is not closing the issue off in a sensible way, but two, is you're sending a signal that it's okay from a regulatory perspective for people to answer your exam question in that way. I think it's, regulators need to start stepping on this one, because firms are, to be fair to firms, they're only responding to what, most of the time, and you could say, well, they should be doing it of their own accord. I agree. But firms are responding to what regulators are telling them to do. And if regulators are coming at them saying, you need to do this by this time, or regulators accept that as the exam answer, then of course you're going to get that behavior from firms. So I pin a lot of this, not because I say the regulator is specifically insisting on that, although sometimes they do, but rather the regulator set the tone. And if we look at the jurisdictions where the regulator comes down on people like a ton of bricks, the US probably the best example, it is there all about get this job done, solve it, fix it. You need to do it as quickly as blah, blah, blah. And let's hire in some consultants to quickly make this thing go away. I think your sticking plaster comment is spot on, right? This is not solving the underlying thing. This is making it look okay. How do we, yeah. And so we got to, but I think there's another piece, which is, let's be fair on regulators and say, what are regulators responding to? Answer is politicians and public outcry. There needs to be a sensible dialogue in that as well, to say that actually, back to your point, the regulatory agenda is always around. There's been a failure in your industry. You failed as a regulator. Well, I could pick examples. Thames Water in the UK seems to be a big good example of regulatory failure. I don't know what the hell has happened there. That's gone too far. But small failures actually should be allowed and permitted as ordinary course of business, to your point. And so I think we need to look at the totality of the system. But I agree with you entirely about the dynamics you described are super prevalent. And we kind of know where this is going. So anybody that's perpetuating this on some level, isn't helping the situation.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's an amazing response, Christian. Thank you so much. Take over conversations.
That's all right. No, it's a really good discussion. It's probably not one we've necessarily covered in great breadth, actually, the behavioural science side of things on some of our programmes. So it's really interesting to be listening to all of this. I suppose the only one other angle probably to talk about is the technology side as well, looking at automation, AI, and the impact, machine learning and so on I guess the behavioural science, the impact with that on compliance and operational risk. Perhaps what you've seen, I guess, in the last few years in terms of how that's impacting that particular area, Christian.
Sure. So it's probably worth having a look at the dynamics of human behavior and the technologies. But obviously, there is a rush to introduce this stuff. And let's be perfectly honest, there's a rush to introduce it because everybody wants to say that they're using AI. But also because it is perceived to be more efficient, cut costs. There's a very positive narrative there, and nobody wants to be the organization that is not deploying it on some level. So there's a little bit of a rush to be doing these things, and we've seen this with other technologies in the past. So there's risks associated with that. What I would say and by the way, that's not to say that it is not useful and that we shouldn't be looking at it, but I'm simultaneously a big fan of what the technology can do, but also a big skeptic about the risks that it poses, and we need to manage both of those things at once. I think the interesting thing about AI is the first thing is that we need to recognize that the humans that we are replacing are flawed. So we are always introducing human judgment into the processes that we have. Humans get tired. They miss things. They have biases. And we know this, and this is a challenge. There's a little bit of a narrative here of sort of criticizing AI for having flaws without recognizing that the humans that we're already employing also have flaws. And so we need to think about that. We will be replacing the human flaws with different kinds of flaws, and we need to recognize what those are. And I'm very worried about things like diversity in the data sets that we're bringing in. There's a real risk here because AI is far more scalable than humans. So anything AI gets wrong, it gets wrong on a very big scale. I question whether we have the necessary data sets. I question about who is programming the algorithms, all those sorts of questions. That's not a reason to go ahead. It's just things to think about as we do this, and recognize that when we bring AI in, it's going to scale up in ways that a human being can't. Therefore, if it poses risk, it's going to pose a larger risk. What I think is also interesting is what is the introduction of these technologies going to do to humans? What are humans going to be doing as the technology comes along? And we've already seen this happening in the physical world with robots in factories, where robots have consistently been able to do things that the average human being was doing. And the sorts of roles that humans have been, I don't want to say reduced to, but moved towards, have been the things that technology can't do. How is that going to play out in the kind of context that we're talking about? Well, the answer is that we've already seen technology taking over analytical things. We can see it moving into other areas. That's going to be pushing humans into doing things that the machines can't yet. Things that involve nuance, judgment, emotional intelligence, the human touch, presence, ENCE, those sorts of things. Now, those areas are where humans excel. Right. They're because the human touch is necessary. It's also when humans pose the greatest amount of risk. When we make mistakes, it is when we are being most human. And so the dynamic that we're going to see is technology will simultaneously do amazing things and probably reduce human risk on some of these things. It'll spot things that we can't spot. It'll make things safer in some respects. And pose its own risks. But what people will be doing is putting them into a different sphere, and therefore the risks associated with your people within an organization are actually going to increase rather than decrease, because the nature of the activities that they're going to be doing. And so as I look at all of these things, I'm kind of simultaneously going, what can the tech do? Where does it fit in? But also, what does that mean for people? And I don't think this means a safer world. I actually think human judgment becomes more interesting. And if we look at in financial services, I wouldn't say that we are always particularly good at human judgment and getting the things right. So the risk I can actually foresee is that as we move to this AI takes over more activities thing, possibly less humans in the organization, that those humans can actually pose a greater risk than the human population does at the moment.
Interesting, yeah. And do you think that from the financial services sector, there's other sectors you can learn from? You mentioned obviously digital manufacturing that can learn from, that are perhaps, I don't mean more advanced, but maybe have more examples of this.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting is so my background, as we've talked, is financial services, but now I work with a broad range of organizations. So I work with UN chemical weapons inspectors and the RAF at one end. Financial services is obviously a key part of it, pharmaceuticals, retail, manufacturing, and then moving into tech. And the reason I can do that breadth is actually everybody says, we're very unique. And to some extent, they're right. And whether they're talking about their industry or the role they do, chemical weapons inspectors probably are the only people that can say we're genuinely unique, because there's only one of them. It's a very specific task. But even there's kind of read across to other things. And I think one of the challenges that we see is we tend to look at what other people in our space, however we define that, are doing. Might be geographic space, might be our sector. Actually, there's loads of things that we can learn from other sectors. If you pull back, remove the technical language, remove the context, and look at the dynamics that are going on. And I would say there's loads of things that we can learn from lots of other industries. And a ton of the work that I do is actually just taking something I've clocked over here and bringing it to bear over here, and kind of not necessarily copy and pasting it, or it might be not doing that because it's a really bad idea, but learning from those things. So I would say to people, I think one of the challenges that compliance people have is they will either just look at what's going on in their industry. Let's benchmark ourselves against our peers. Well, that's interesting. But what happens if your peers are getting this badly wrong? Don't copy, best practice, I always find hilarious. Well, what does that mean? Best practice is what some consultant has decided is the right answer. Well, just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean it's right. It could be awfully wrong. There may be things that we can learn from other industries and contexts. And so I'd encourage compliance people to talk to compliance people in other industries. But I'd also encourage them to talk to people that are trying to do a similar role in completely different contexts. And that's where I think compliance takes us into the role of marketing. If we're trying to influence people, understand them, marketers are very, very good at that. So let's have a look and see how they solve certain problems. Governments are generally not as good at this stuff, but they do things badly, but sometimes they do it quite well. What can we learn from the way that they're trying to impose rules, restrictions, norms on us? So the read across is absolutely huge. And I wouldn't want to almost say, look at this industry because it's perfect. I just want to say, look somewhere you have never looked before, particularly where the way they talk about what they're doing, it feels counterintuitive to you, because that for me is where the gold is to be found. If we really want to change this stuff, it probably requires some fundamental shifts. And that's you're not going to get that just by looking at the environment that and particularly where we've got people moving between firms, there's pretty much similar approaches to things within an industry. So maybe it's worth looking elsewhere.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
I love the comment you made earlier there, Christian, about kind of the airlines as well, and about how it's based on, if you don't report, that's a bigger issue than underreporting. And I think we've always looked at reporting as a negative. And now the big focus is on information sharing, especially top down as opposed to bottom up, which is mostly what we've seen in the past. And if you look at this practically speaking, the government, the FIUs, the police force, they have much more information real time on emerging typologies than we do within the industry. But yet there still is this kind of like cart before the horse approach where there's a big dependency on SAR reporting. And then we're left with that kind of black box and expected just to move forward. And that creates, in my opinion, a real culture of negativity is not the right word, but uncertainty. And, it's what shall I do with this? And the response from the FIUs on, well, just follow your internal procedure, I think is a very, very dangerous psychological response for a government body to give, because one, it doesn't give a reward system for the reporting. And secondly, it just says back to the institution, okay, you've reported this, but we're not going to tell you anything, but just go back to what you do day to day. And if you think you need to do someone, do it. So there's also a real lack of assurance that organizations are on the right path or indeed looking at the right things. So what do you think, FIUs can do better, and regulators to give that better assurance and support psychologically as well to compliance teams, in particular financial crime, where people are actually trying to do the right thing and empowering them a little bit with, everybody likes to be told they've done a good job.
I'll just quickly come back on the airline thing, because this was something that just occurred to me as you were talking. It is worth noting that the airline industry works really well in the sky. It works if we've all experienced airlines losing luggage, messing up with their IT. There's let's not, we need to be careful when we take the example of the airline industry and recognizing the safety critical bits, they get it right. But the rest of it, there seems to be a bit of a challenge. So they're not perfect either, and they can learn from other industries. But let's come to your point about the feedback loop. I think this is so important and so underrated. And it's, and again, let's have a look at why does it happen? Well, it is easier if you are an official body not to give too much guidance, because if you give guidance or you point them in the wrong direction, that turns out to have missed something. You own the problem, not the firms that you're pointing at. And so from a regulator or a governmental body perspective, it's much easier to go, no, you should do what you want to. We're not going to tell you how to run, blah, 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 abdication of responsibility piece, yep. Right? And I agree with you entirely. So there's a certain point where as a regulator, you don't want to be overly intervening, right? And second guessing what the management are doing. But equally, you do need to be giving people encouragement, going, yes, that is helpful. On the feedback thing, I think this is so important. And if we think about, this is a really good illustration of how you can pick things from other contexts. Let's think about another context in which we want people to report things and how that operates. And my favorite example of this, and when I mention this in the UK, people go, oh, is see it, say it, sorted, right? So this, for people who aren't aware of this is the campaign. The transport police want people to come forward and report things because they recognize they can't be everywhere and they might not spot things that somebody who's used to a particular environment will spot. And so the idea here is that they want the general public to come forward and report things. And they've come up with this slogan, see it, say it, sorted. And I love this because what it's basically saying is, if you see something, don't worry about what it is. You just tell us and we will take care. It's not see it, say it, sort it. It's see it, say it, sorted. We will take care of it. So that's taking we are taking the responsibility off you, and we will deal with it. I think that's a very positive psychological message. Now, I once had the opportunity to report something through that. I was like desperately looking for it. And I once saw an unattended bag on a station platform, took a picture of it, sent it off. And here was the interesting thing. I got an automated response that says, thank you for reporting this, which is sort of what you'd expect. But then about half an hour later, I got something that looked like it had been crafted by a human, don't know whether it was or not, that said, thank you for reporting the bag. We have investigated and we've taken care of it. And we really appreciate you reporting it. Please continue to do so. And that I loved, because that recognizes that if I don't know what's happened to my report, next time I'm not going to bother, because you kind of think, well, what do they do with it? Now, I have no idea whether I thwarted a bomb attack or I just reunited someone with their gym kit, but I felt good about doing it. And I think that, so there's a good answer. They really understand the psychology there because they know it doesn't feel normal to report stuff. Now, if we transfer that into other contexts, we would say, in the example, I give you some useful info. I don't know whether what I've told you is useful. Have you done anything with that? Is that the kind of thing you want to hear? Because you sort of go, well, we can't tell you anything about it. Now, I'm not suggesting you say, well, we're currently investigating these things and we're going to, you have to give people detail. Give them a sense that whether, is this more warmer, hotter or colder? Is this the sort of thing you want to see? Is this useful? And we've got to start telling stories about what happens to this stuff, because otherwise it's just a soulless task. And you just think, I don't believe they're doing anything with it. And if you don't think they're doing anything with it, you're not going to put the effort in the first place. And more to the point, you're then not going to transmit that to the people in your organization whose help you need to get this stuff done. That this, you're going to signal to them, this is a tedious process. So understanding the psychology, I think, is critical. And you're absolutely right. We're not thinking about this from the perspective, back to the original point, of the humans in the mix, because the human, and this is a problem, AI doesn't have sentience, right? So it won't get sort of, oh, nobody's done anything with this, they're sitting on it, whatever, won't think like that, right? So that's a good benefit of AI in a way. But humans need that feedback loop. We need to know that what we're doing is valuable, and particularly where it's frankly a thankless task and you're plowing through a whole load of stuff, and then add in the dynamics you were talking about before, about clearing backlogs as quickly as possible. Well, we shouldn't be surprised if the quality of the information that's being fed in is pretty limited, and people are either reporting things that, and we're wasting a ton of resource and effort. So I think this is really, really significant. And so my message to any authorities is understand that at the end of this, there is going to be a human being that is feeding into this process, either supervising AI or doing it themselves. If there's no feedback loop there, then you're just sort of setting them off on a blind task. It's not, it feels like some sort of ridiculous party game that never ends, right? It's like we have to give people the sense that they're doing something worthwhile. We have to feed back to them, and we have to recognize that this is human beings whose judgment we're relying on. And the more you say this is really important, then the more presumably you want intelligent people doing this job. Intelligent people need feedback on how they're performing, otherwise they won't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And again, as Jane said earlier, this is something we haven't really focused enough on. And I'm seeing it. I say to people, especially we do an MLRO course with raw compliance, and one of the biggest focuses on becoming an MLRO is emotional intelligence. It's being able to convey a message in 10 different ways to 10 different people, so it resonates and they understand it in the context of what they do. And, you need to be able, manipulate it, it's not the right word, but you need to be able to change your verbiage and your approach, and also to work with people who have different ways of understanding what it is you're presenting. So we talked about, and I said this earlier, that, the future of compliance is data-driven, it's tech-driven. But again, with the emergence of a lot of more, again, sophisticated psychological crimes, it also brings it back to the psychology of compliance, for me, has really been negated over the years and has to an effect been lost. And when we bring it back to the human-centric approach, it really starts to make a lot more sense. And it's going to be interesting to see that revolution, so to speak, happening within the industry moving forward, because that's what needs to happen in order for us to really drive systemic change. We're seeing so much repeat enforcement action because we're not holistically remediating, or accountability just isn't there. And you can take as much enforcement action as you want on accountability, but when people are concerned about the personal liability versus accountability, you're not drumming home the right message. I don't know if you would concur with that, or whether you have a difference of opinion, or if you want to add anything else.
No, look, so I think several things, again, always sparking lots of thought. I mean, the first one is, I think language is really important. So one of the things that we don't often think about is that if we're in a compliance function dealing with a technical issue, we make the presumption, and this is a subconscious thing, not necessarily conscious, where we think everybody else sees this, has the same significance, right? That it's just as important to them as it is to us. Now, one of the things that is worth recognizing is that in any walk of life, in anything that we do, right, our own perspective isn't necessarily the perspective of other people's. And I always jokingly say the average employee isn't interested in compliance. Now, what I mean by that is I don't mean they want to break the rules. What I mean is they're not passionate about it. And I know they're not passionate about it because if they were, they'd be working in compliance, right? They care about sales or whatever their job is. And so as we look at how we communicate with people, I think it's worth, you use the word translate. I think that's really important. We need to speak their language. And that might be, if it's training, the way that they learn. But we often bombard people with a load of crap they don't need to know. So, and this it's a slightly controversial point here, but when we teach people about money laundering, right, we teach them how to launder money. Now, what are and then you quiz them about what are the 3 stages of money laundering. Now, there are going to be some people who are in roles who do need to know that, but the average employee probably doesn't need to be taught how to launder money. And then we chuck in technical terms like KYC and PEP and AML. We use all these technical. Now, people might need that language because it's relevant, but we should ask ourselves the question, is this language helping to make our subject more accessible? Or do they just need to know what to look out for? And how do we help them deliver what it is that we need to help them deliver out? And I think often what we do is we take regulations and we codify the regulations in our policies because that's safe, right? And then we train people on the policies. You might as well be saying to people, I'm going to read the regulations to you. And then we ask them questions like, the failure to comply with this will see you go to jail for how many years, right? 5, 10, 15, 20. That's not useful information. Nobody needs to know that this one's a 5-year and that's a 15-year. So if you're going to break one of these 2 rules, break the 5-year because you'll be in jail for less. They know it's a pointless question. We know we don't need to test that. We should be testing them on useful, practical things. So translating, the job, I think, of compliance is to translate the regulation and the risk behind the regulation into something that is meaningful and usable for people on the ground. And therefore, we can start to say, okay, we've equipped you not with the technical knowledge that we need, but the practical knowledge that you need. And that might just be practical knowledge that's akin to the see it, say it, sorted of. If you spot something weird, you have to worry. Don't worry about it. Come and talk to us, and we'll work out with you whether it's an issue. You don't need to take it all on your own. Or actually, we're going to give you enough information because this is something where you can make decisions on your own. We're going to empower you to do that. Now, if you adopt that approach, then I think linking it to the accountability thing, then I think that would be a reasonable way of saying, we have done everything we can in our organization to try and manage this. And that ought to be a good exam answer to go to the regulator and say, I have done because I have made sure that we have discharged our responsibilities by putting decisions in the right hands. They have the right information. They understand what they're doing. That ought to be a good enough exam answer. Instead, one, that doesn't tend to happen. So the accountable people can't necessarily go to the regulator and have this discussion. But even if they could, you're absolutely right. You'll get regulators auditing things by going, well, I mean, you didn't tell them what the regulation was called. So how are they supposed to know what this is? Well, that I think is dumb. Right? It's regulators need to be looking at the objectives and saying, has this person genuinely tried to deal with this sensibly? And if so, then we should cut them some slack and recognize that they have done everything. They've tried to answer the exam question to the best of their ability. But they don't do that. And so the trouble is, if you've got regulators coming in and doing kind of performative auditing of how this thing is done, or come in when something has gone wrong and look performatively, the sort of courtroom scenario about, well, I know you're under massive amounts of pressure, but why did you decide to do that rather than this? And surely you should have paused to think about, all those sorts of things. It's going to be a problem. So I would keenly suggest to people within firms is get a better exam answer. And I think it works along the lines I've outlined. But I suggest to regulators, if you are auditing and assessing people on the basis of theoretically have they done something based on a presumption of how the world ought to be that's not realistic, then you're exacerbating the problem.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned something there which made me think about the US whistleblowing rules. And I just wanted to, I know it's maybe a little bit abstract, but I just wanted to quickly get your view on it since we've got you on. As obviously you're probably fully aware about in the US, even if you are party to the actual wrongdoing, if you support enforcement action and the provision of you whistleblow, you're then entitled to up to 20% of the recovery of monies through successful enforcement action. This has been a model which appears to be working quite well. You can still go to prison in the US, but when you come out, there was one guy recently, I think he came out to a 120 million windfall. Well, how do you see that from a behavioral perspective in the context of encouraging good behavior?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's a nice moral dilemma. Because on the one hand, we should not be rewarding people for bad behavior. And in extremis, you could see a thing where somebody commits a crime and then reports themselves and sort of expects to get paid for that, right? So we've got to stop that kind of thing from happening. But I think we have to recognize several things. The whistleblowing, the reason that I think we need to think about rewarding whistleblowers is that the consequences are that you may never work again. And so let's ignore the situation where somebody is sort of involved in just standard rewarding of whistleblowers. I think makes sense because the hurdles to speaking up are massive, and we all know what happens. These people may never work in the industry again. They may never be able to work. They get isolated. So there are all sorts of challenges there. So I think recognizing that you may need a safety cushion if you're blowing the whistle on something major is helpful. Money is also a powerful incentive, and if we're thinking about financial services, right? Let's be honest, lots of people working in financial services wouldn't work in the industry if it didn't pay what it pays. So money obviously drives human behavior on some level. It starts to get really interesting when you talk about the scenarios that you've just outlined. And honestly, I don't know what the right answer is, but I wouldn't want to rule out things that were on some level behaviorally effective. And we can't be puritanical about these things. If we want to solve these problems, we have to be realistic. Now, I don't know where you draw that line. And I think it does feel really uncomfortable as a member of the public sort of going, well, hold on a minute, here's a criminal and we're gonna sort of give them some money because they've kind of helped the police. But then we also, if somebody's a police informant, we do give them shorter jail sentences. So you could argue that to a certain extent there is a form of reward for coming forward. So I think this is really challenging, but I think we need to go there and explore this stuff. And this is where I think, there are academics that look at these sorts of things and study them. I think this is really important. It is important to go there and have the discussion. So I wouldn't want to rule it in or out without having there are all, as with, and I think there's a really important general compliance point here, as well, which is we often like to codify the world simply, right, into sort of black and white. This is a good thing, this is a bad thing, right? So here's a whistleblower, we should give them some money and this is a criminal and we shouldn't give them some money, right? Life doesn't work like that. There's a grey area in there. And just as we think about compliance, not as being ethical dilemmas don't neatly come with a bow wrap going, here is an ethical dilemma, we will make this as simple as possible, right? They come at awkward ways. Sometimes there's not even a right answer. This is a really good illustration of how it's hard to write rules and processes from a sort of compliance officer side of the fence or regulator side of the fence. So I'm open to all of these things. I don't have the answers, but I think it's worth exploring.
Amazing. I honestly, I think it'll be, I think it needs to be looked at. And many regulators are looking to the US now to see how successful this kind of new approach could be. And it is proving pretty successful in the US. So I'm excited to see where this moves us forward. I'm conscious we're coming up on the hour and we've already kind of kept you over the 45 minutes, which we'd promised. Jane, do you want to add anything, any questions about what we've discussed or anything around Frankfurt and what Christian is going to be speaking to?
I know that you're just, with Frankfurt, I think you're finalising that with Claire at the moment, aren't you, topics for Frankfurt?
Yeah, the sneak preview of sort of direction of travel, and it's going to be slightly provocative. So I'll give my philosophy on these sorts of events is there is no point in turning up to these events to hear things you have heard before. My aim is to come and bring a different perspective and to provoke people, not in a nasty way, but just to provoke people to think a little bit differently about it. So the working title for the session is going to be something along the lines of why the biggest financial crime risk in this room is sitting in this room. The point being that if we don't, so I don't genuinely mean that the audience are a bunch of criminals, but what I want to point towards is some of the things that we've been talking about on the show, which is to say that we need to start thinking behaviorally. And if you are working in a financial crime, whether you're a leader in that space or whether you're just someone just doing it, we need to be thinking about humans, how they behave and how they react in the real world. And so that might be the way that we manage people, the way we incentivize them, the way we communicate our program, the way we put ourselves into the shoes of the people that might be trying it on to try and use our organization for nefarious purposes. So my point is that we often think about financial crime in terms of the regulation, in terms of the technical stuff. There's actually a massive human component there. And if we don't reflect that and understand that and think about that and design our program around it, then actually we're not doing what we need to do, and therefore we are increasing the risk of financial crime. And so if you're a function whose job is to reduce the risk of financial crime, then it would probably be a good idea to do things that reduce it rather than increase it.
Absolutely, that sounds absolutely spot on. And as I said, I think previously we haven't covered enough of this within Pro. So yeah, really pleased that we're going to be having that on the programme in Frankfurt. So that's fantastic. Because I think that was one of our last questions that Oonagh and I had, was about if you had one message to give any senior leadership teams, board level in financial institutions today about people and compliance, what would that message be?
Well, I'll reiterate what I said earlier on, which is we need to think not how we would like people to behave, but how they are likely to behave. And so that applies to employees, but it also applies to clients, right? So we have to work out, and obviously we don't want to accuse every single one of our customers of being a fraudster or trying something on, but we have to recognize the realities of what humans are going to do. How are they going to try and game our systems? And I'll just expand a tiny bit on what I said before. Think about this. Lots of people in financial services are paid to find arbitrage opportunities. Traders are paid to go and arb things. That's their job. That's how they get rewarded. So let's not be surprised when those same traders try and arb our rules. They're deploying exactly the skill set you've asked them to deploy. Ditto, compliance people, we have deployed them to think critically about the compliance risks that are there. Don't be surprised when they deploy that critical thinking on how we are running the organization. So I would say that in many cases, the skills that we're hiring for in financial services may lend themselves to bending of rules, to thinking differently about things, to arbitraging those rules. And that is worth recognizing. Not saying everybody sets out to do the wrong thing, a very small percentage will, and we need to catch them. But as we try and manage everybody else, it's worth reflecting that they are humans, they are sentient beings. And the way that we influence sentient beings isn't just by telling them what to do. We have to think much more intelligently about it.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Christian.
Christian, it's been an absolute pleasure. One of the things that I love speaking with you is you've always the most upbeat, positive outlook, and it's really lovely to hear that. We're very, very lucky actually on this entire series, positive and really proactive people, and you know, you are certainly in one of our top as well. So thank you so much indeed. Jane, I don't know if you just want to close it out with any final comments.
Yeah, no, just a massive thank you for your input and insights today. We're really looking forward to hearing from you and meeting you obviously in person in Frankfurt in September as well. But yeah, I think there's definitely loads of sort of key takeaways here for our audience for sure.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day to both of you.
Yeah, you too. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Christian.
Bye. See you.